Sup guys, and welcome to my lecture on Unity lighting. I'm gonna start off with some fundamental stuff because really there's no magic button in Unity that will make things look good, so you need to set up your scenes right so it makes sense. And that involves some illustration stuff, some photography stuff. I'll try to cover all of my bases here. And you need to know how this stuff works because Unity isn't super photorealistic and you will need to fake some of these things. Unity also isn't very good at some specular reflections. The lights are very uniform. I'm going to talk about how we can work around these things in the second part of this video. And even if you know some of this stuff or all of this stuff, it's not a bad thing to remind yourself of. So first of all, let's cover context. Where will these images be used? Well, most of these images are going to be used in UI screens in the game, and they'll be displayed alongside a bunch of text and stuff. So they need to stand out. They need to have high contrast, and they need to be very easily readable by the viewer. People will only look at them for a few seconds at most, so they need to know what's going on as fast as possible. So the reason why I bring up context is because some of these images aren't going to be 16 by 9, or they'll have some text overlaying parts of the image, which is good to keep in mind if you know where they're going to be used. So for example, in this image over here, it's a good idea to not put anything important in the top left hand corner, and it's good to note that this isn't 16 by 9. It's a bit thinner than that, so we should keep our areas of focus around the middle parts of the image. So what is good lighting? Well, good lighting is something that is both believable and tells the viewer what they're supposed to look at. So for example, over here, you can see how her face is lit up and everything else is a bit more in shadow, a bit darker, lower contrast, and how this is the highest contrast area of the image. Here you can see that she is clearly silhouetted against the background. You can read all the forms, and the brightest part over here, this magic spell, is also the most saturated. Here you can see that the two figures are clearly separated from the background. The darkest parts of the image are here, and it's the primary focal point, the thing you look at first, and then the secondary thing is this village. Here in this piece by Jama, you get the same thing, where these guys have kind of a spotlight on them, and they have the highest contrast over here. Everything else is a bit more dulled down, it has a bit less detail, and all of our attention is on these two guys. So you need to know what's important in your scene and what isn't. So you can highlight the important bits or the important focal points, and then you can dull down the rest of it. We're not making a Renaissance painting where there's a million things going on at the same time and most of them are the same contrast and you don't know where you're supposed to look and you need to look at the image for 20 seconds to figure out what's going on. Make sure to keep things simple and understandable at a glance. So the first thing we're going to talk about in terms of contrast is going to be value contrast and atmosphere. Air isn't completely transparent, so it absorbs some of the light hitting it. The light has to come from somewhere, so usually it's either the sky color or a mix of the sky, which is the ambient light, and the sun or any other lighting that's hitting it. So when this happens, the things closer to the camera naturally stay high contrast, and the further away things get, they lose contrast and usually saturation as they get closer to the sky color. When they are very far away, they become almost like silhouettes of one color or a smooth gradient, but sometimes you still get some detail. It's just you need to know where to leave the detail. And this is something that needs a bit of setup in Unity to be a bit more realistic, since in Unity, fog is uniform and is only affected by the distance you are from something, and not how far away from the ground it is. So in real life, heavier air falls towards the ground, so there's usually more fog the lower something is to the ground. So this naturally separates a lot of the faraway elements in our scene, which is good for us, but we're going to need to find a way to fake this in Unity. So in all of these images, you can see that the further away things get, the lighter they get. But you will also notice that they are darker than the sky behind them, usually. Or at least in most of the image, that's the case. So why is this? And this is because of conservation of energy, which is just a fancy term to say, okay, if you have a light source, and in this case the sky is our light source, then anything the light hits cannot be brighter than the light source. So you can see here that even though these mountains are quite white, in fact, but they're not as bright as the sky because they don't reflect all of the light that hits them, just a lot of it. You will also notice how the dark areas of the image are the ones that are most affected by this. So for example, here in the distance, you see this mountain, the sunlight hitting it is still relatively bright, but everything in shadow is a bit more washed out, and all of the shadows are raised in value. So to give another example of this conservation of energy thing, if you look at mirrors or glass or anything reflective, usually you will notice that their reflection is not as bright as the thing they're reflecting, especially in these kinds of outdoor scenes. So here you can see that these windows are much darker, basically just a darker version of the sky. Another way that this applies is, for example, when you have any of our light source basically, but in this case I'm going to use these lamps, you can see that while they are lighting things up, the areas that are lit up are always darker than the light source itself. So we need to keep this in mind because if we have something that's light, like an emissive material, like lamps or the sniper's glowy eyes or whatever, we need to make sure that we don't create lights that look out of place by being too bright for the thing that is emitting the light, basically. I'm going to briefly touch on Fresnel because this is something that isn't really represented in Unity, but you need to keep in mind for your overpaints, and oftentimes it can make things look a lot more realistic just with a few tweaks. So in real life, the bigger the angle between you and the light source, the more objects reflect light. So sometimes this is very subtle and sometimes this is noticeable. Especially in shiny surfaces where this effect is a bit more pronounced. Like the edges of the reflections are going to be brighter and higher contrast than the middle of the object. So over here, for example, you see on the white ball how the edges are colored with the sky's color. Over here you have a bit of red, over here you have a bit of blue, and these reflections are really mostly noticeable on the edges of objects and not so much on the middle of it. So we can kind of fake it in Photoshop with bloom effects, but sometimes you might have to go in and manually paint some of these. And over here we see the sunlight on the left which is being reflected and how it's a lot more bright and saturated around the edge. So like shiny objects have a thinner Fresnel, so it's more pronounced on the edges, but it's kind of thin. And then duller objects, oftentimes you won't even see this. Even so, if you look at this road, for example, if you look at the road at a very specific angle close to the ground, then it can sometimes appear kind of like a mirror. It's going to reflect the sky and any objects that are here. So keep this in mind as well. It's not something that you need to put in everywhere, but in some very specific cases, you are going to have to paint this in manually. One thing to keep in mind when making your images is that the screen can only display so much brightness. Our screens only have these values to work with, whereas something bright like the sun would be way off here, and we would need to figure out how to represent it. We could focus our attention on this area and shift the values of our image to them, but then we'd lose some detail in the dark parts of the image. This is what happens when you try to expose your camera to show more detail in the sun, for example. To give the illusion of light, we need contrast. If we darken the rest of the image, like in the sun example, this leaves us more values to use for the lights. Since the difference between the light and the dark areas are so big, this also makes the light appear brighter. But if you overdo this and you expose for the bright areas, you can often get a silhouette effect where everything else is too dark and just has too little information and contrast. If you go in the other direction, however, you risk overexposing your lights and losing too much information there. And then you have huge chunks of your image overexposed, and it doesn't look very nice. So what we need is a balance, and thankfully we have a lot of control over this, since we're setting up our custom lighting ourselves, rather than relying on the real world. In photography, what you sometimes do with these high contrast situations is you take multiple pictures at different exposures, and then you combine them to bring back some of the details that might otherwise be lost. The important thing here is that you want to keep your overall value structure, where the bright parts are still brighter than the dark parts, and you don't have a ton of contrast everywhere. Like I said earlier, the key here is balance. Decide which information is important and center the image around that. Now, we could lower the contrast of the whole image to show more things, but this can end up making things look washed out. For most things, we want the brightest part of the image to be close to white and the darkest close to black. This is some footage that's shot on a high-end camera which isn't yet color graded, and it should show this example. We can try to keep more information without completely clipping it and getting rid of it by rolling off the ends of the value spectrum. So you have less contrast for the very bright stuff and less contrast for the very dark stuff, and then you keep most of your values for the middle range. One thing to notice is that the lit parts of the image have more contrast than the shadow parts. If you have less light, then there's a smaller value range you can work with. You can't get very light objects in the dark areas, and the already dark objects aren't getting much darker, so their value ranges are closer together. So this helps us group together our shadows, both in the render and in the overpaint, and help us achieve a more graphic read. You can exaggerate this effect in Photoshop, but I'll go into that later. Another type of contrast is color. We want to keep things simple, so try not to have too many light sources or light source colors. As a general rule of thumb, one primary light and one secondary light works for most things. For example, a strong and sharp sunlight and a diffuse sky fill light. And we need to know where to look, and we need to also be able to tell where the light source is coming from in most cases. So make sure you don't have a lot of lights with the same brightness, as this can lead to areas being equally lit and the viewer won't be sure which part of the image is important. If you have lots of lights, make sure one type of light or one light is stronger than the others. With natural light, or at least daylight, there's a temperature difference between the sunlight, which is warm and bright, and sky, which is more cool. In Unity, this is one of the harder ones to make look right, as the lack of global illumination can make things feel a bit fake, and you have to try to balance the image so the light isn't hitting everything and then making everything feel equally important. So I'll talk about how we can set this up to the best of our ability later. With artificial lights, we have a bit more control, as we can place them wherever we want. Also, it's really good for us because we can put in a light that's a unique color, and then that can easily draw our attention to the focal point. And also, since a lot of artificial lighting scenarios are a bit darker in general, it lets us keep the contrast between the lights and the darks a bit more, while still looking believable. We want our images to read quickly, so this means that aside from all of the other stuff, we need to have easy to identify shapes and silhouettes. Now, this can be done by dividing your image into foreground, background, midground, which obviously works and gives us a good read, but you don't have to follow this as a rule, like an exact thing that you have to do. The important part is that your points of interest aren't all the same size and the same distance from the camera. We want contrast in the position of things. So for example, here you can see that one guy is much closer to the camera, one guy is further away, so this guy is obviously more important. And then here you have like the size difference between these tanks or whatever they are. Here your focal point is the biggest thing on the screen and it's the closest to the camera. If there's too much stuff going on at the same time, this can interfere with readability, so I would recommend putting in only as much as necessary to communicate the idea. So for example, this is a really great image, but if you wanted to simplify it and make it an even quicker read, we could just cut out this part of the screen and just crop it so it's only these three guys. And that way we have less visual information on the screen at the same time, and it's easier for us to focus on both the people and these wasp things that are around here. Now it's not bad to have a bit of extra information, but you need to think about how long the viewer will actually look at the image. So as long as it's obvious what you're communicating and what your idea is, you can have a bit of extra detail as long as it's not also fighting for your focus. So you have like your primary focal point, and then your secondary, tertiary, and then everything else is pretty unimportant. It's hard for us to take in a lot of detail at the same time, so it is important that we have some areas of rest. So, for example, we put most of the detail in our focal point and then have the rest of the image have less detail and be a bit more ambiguous. One way of doing this is with depth of field, aka camera focus. So I'm going to be talking about that later. But also this applies to everything and not just setting up the lighting. So if something isn't the focus, then you can try to simplify it. Now, if you're trying to depict, for example, a bunch of soldiers, you don't have to have them all be doing like different things and be super unique. You could just group them together. That's the idea of the shot, to show that there's a lot of them. And just have them as like a single shape, for example. Or over here, like they're a bit more separated, but we can see how this guy is obviously more of a focus than the others. You have the whole atmosphere thing going on, and also you can notice that around them is not super contrasty, especially here above his head. Like there is not a lot of value contrast going on, which makes it easier for us to separate him from the background, and the image reads well even from far away. So kind of a similar thing has been done over here. Like, for example, if the guy that painted this had decided to just put a bunch of rocks behind his head, obviously it wouldn't be such a good read. So keep this in mind when you have subjects, that it's good to have the background be simpler around them so they can read better. Like, it doesn't matter if this is darker or lighter than the subject. If it's closer to one value, like over here, it's very low contrast, or over here, or over here as well, then it'll be much easier to read. Alright, so this is some camera footage of a cityscape, and we can see that the image is very low contrast. So we have a lot of information everywhere, but now we need to compress this down so it's a bit more contrasty and we get a bit more of a sense of light. So here we can see that there's a little bit of information in the darks over here in this range, but we could just cut them out, and then this will lead to us getting a bit more contrast. And then over here in the lights, we have a bunch of information, but we could try to compress this just a little bit. So let's have the lights be a smaller value range, and then have everything else pretty close to the same as it was before. So the difference here is pretty big. Now, if we wanted to get more information out of the city, let's say this was like a super high quality format, we could try to push the exposure and get some more out of it. But the problem is that it just leads to a bunch of things getting overexposed. And yeah, we can bring those back in a bit. And I mean, this can work. So let's just analyze some images real quick. I'm using some free software called KGamut for this, because it shows you more or less where your colors are lying and also where your values are lying in the image. Now you can filter, for example, if I only want to know what colors my darker values are, I can do that, or the middle ones, the lighter ones. So you can see that in general the darker values are a bit less saturated, less colorful, And then as we increase the brightness, we get to the more saturated parts. Now, this image reads really well because it has a very good value grouping. Like this shape over here is a big block of dark, and then this shape over here is also a very well silhouetted front plane, and then everything else is a bit lighter and a bit less contrasty, so it kind of reads like one plane, or I guess you could say that this is the midground. Now, if we look at just the color information on this, yeah, we have a lot of color, but like the most saturated bits are this red, and the slightly less saturated bits are this blue. And over here in the shadows, we don't get as much saturation, and it's all pretty dark, and they're grouping together, they don't have a lot of detail. And yeah, next image, you can see this is another really colorful one. Here we have most of the image in the blue and the pink area, but we also have a highlight over here, which is the red tail lights. And as you can see, there is no red in the rest of the image. Everything else is pretty, complementary colors. They're kind of in the same gamma or gamut, or whatever you want to call it. But this red and this dark silhouette of the person on the light background is what brings our eye towards the focal point. Now this is more of a warm and cool type image, where you have the warmth from the fire and the sunlight over here in this part, and then the rest of the image is quite cool. It's quite bluish. Like everything over here is pretty blue, honestly. And we have two very bright spots, being our sun and this motorcycle, whatever this is, to draw our eye between these two focal points, basically. Now, I wouldn't really say that this is the focal point. I would say that this whole area is kind of the secondary thing that we focus on. Now, it's good here that we have a lot of contrast over here. We have some sort of like light hitting her on the side, and also this very bright spot, which is the only blue bright spot on the image. And then we have the fire, which is kind of the only red thing in this image. And yeah, it's pretty simple in terms of colors. Like, as you can see, there's no like pinks or greens or any of that stuff. It's mainly just warm and cool in here. And here we have another picture from the same scene, basically, where we don't have the kind of super warm parts, but this image still reads really well because of the red of the bike and the bright light contrasting with the overall dark scene. Now, here we have a bit more of a colorful image. It's still quite warm and cool. But basically, we have two light sources, the sunlight and this magic that he's doing. And we have in the background the whole warm versus cool gradient going on. And here in the foreground, we have the strong colors which really draw our eye. Now, here in some God of War screenshots, while these images are kind of colorful, they really don't have a lot of saturation in them. Like, you can tell that these images aren't dull by any means, but everything falls under this kind of spectrum. Here is a really colorful image, and even though there is all of this saturation and all of these bright things going on, your eye is still led pretty well to the focal point because there's this blue thing over here, which isn't really absent in the rest of the image. Like, there is like two specks over here, which are a pretty similar color, but they're less saturated, so they don't draw your eye as much. And yes, the sky is also a similar color, but it's not nearly as saturated or as bright as this. Okay, so this image also has a very nice color contrast where this guy with the yellow robe, like there is no other saturated yellow anywhere in the image. Like, yeah, these rocks are kind of yellow. You can probably tell they're close to the middle, a bit on the warm side, but his robe is just so different and so contrasty from everything else that it just immediately draws our eye here. And then the second thing would be this blue and white sky area, because it has a lot of contrast and a lot of brightness over here, and this blue color isn't present anywhere else either. So here is another example of cold versus warm. Here you have some saturated yellows and a kind of saturated blue, and even when you turn it to grayscale, it still reads pretty well. So with color, you can kind of get away with a lot of things as long as your values are good. Here we have a similar thing to the monk, where the red robes are contrasting against everything else in the image because it's just so different and so saturated, even though the image is still bright. Like we can see that some of the greens are close in saturation to the reds, but they're not taking our focus as much. Here we have a lot of color, like for example these blue guys. Like the blue isn't anywhere else in the image. It's a bit bluish here, but it's not as blue as these. And they also silhouette really nicely against the background. But the main thing here is that the values kind of carry the image. You have these strong shapes over here. Like this whole area is a very similar value. It's very low contrast. And then this area over here is a bit higher contrast, but you can still clearly see the light and dark shapes. So I guess in this case, this would be the most information we have in the image. But since our eyes are also drawn to the color contrast over here, and it also has a bit of value contrast, that's probably our secondary focal point. And here we can see that even if your image's colors are basically all on one side of the spectrum, you can still have things pop and contrast together as long as the values and the saturation are working for you. Here you have almost no saturation. Everything is pretty much the same color. You have a little bit of color variation, but everything is close to the center. And I wouldn't say this is a bad image because the contrast still guides your eye. You know that you need to look at him first because he has the most information, and then he's pointing at her, so you look at her secondly, and this guy is off in the background doing his thing. Here, this is another very simple image. You just have a kind of cool lighting scenario. Everything's kind of dark with a bit of fill light coming from the top, and then you have a very nice kind of bright light highlight over here leading the eye. And this is another warm and cool one where the light and the contrast kind of drives your eye. Like even if I change this to grayscale, you can see that this guy's face has the most contrast out of everything in the image. It has a nice light and simple backdrop which lets us make out the shape a lot easier. Like over here, if you didn't have the hood and it was just the background, then I'm sure it wouldn't be as good of a read, which is probably why that's there. But yeah, here you have some more pretty good values where most of the contrast is on him. He's kind of warmer, and then everything else is cold in the image, and so our eye is drawn to this because it's different from everything else, and also it has the most contrast and information. And this is another very simple one color one basically, where everything is in this kind of warm range of the spectrum, but since there is the contrast between this, which is very saturated all the way over here, and then everything else which is a bit more desaturated and muddied down, like this is equally as good as having the whole thing shifted over and then being over here. In this case, you would have more colors because you would have some blues, some purples, whatever. But this also works because it's all relative. Hey guys, and welcome to the Unity part of this tutorial. I'm gonna start by talking about how you can set up your camera, your post-processing, and all of this volumetric stuff that I told you how to install in the last bit. So let's start with the camera. First of all, let's just make a new camera, and then let's set up an angle for this camera. So when you're in the viewport over here, you can press Ctrl-Shift-F to make the camera look at what you're looking at. So for example, let's look for a camera angle that's pretty similar to the trailer, and let's just get them both in frame, maybe have it not as wide angle, and that should be fine for now. Okay, so for the camera, you're gonna want to see the skybox over here, but right now I don't think we have any skybox, so I'm gonna go ahead and put on the sunny afternoon one. When you go to your camera, you're gonna want to type post and then add a post-process layer and a post-process volume. The post-process layer basically turns on the post-processing, and the volume is the thing that has the information of which effects to use and whatnot. For this to work, you need to have both the camera set to the layer transparent effects and the post-process layer to transparent effects. And now we can click is global over here and choose a post-processing profile. I would recommend starting with the artbook render one because I quite like how it looks. But we're gonna need to turn off some of this stuff first. Right now the depth of field is completely wonky, so we're gonna tweak that later. Let's turn off the vignette and maybe turn off the auto exposure. The reason why we want to turn off auto exposure is because if we end up rendering different passes, like different lightings, we don't want the brightness to vary between each render. Let's turn down the bloom as well. And this should be an okay starting point for us. Sometimes you might have better luck with any of these. For example, if you're making a sunny scene, you could try the sunny day or the sunny afternoon profiles, and they might do a better job than the artbook. One way to get a starting point for your image is to find one of our already existing lighting profiles, because if there's already something that's pretty close to what you want, it'll be faster, as with the post-processing. So if you type here light set or lighting or whatever we actually call them nowadays, let's say we want a night scene. Let's start with the FDM night light set, and over here we have a bunch of stuff including the lighting settings. If we click this, and we can also find lighting settings in the project window for a bunch of different lighting setups, we can click set to scene and it should transfer the lighting over to ours. Okay, so we need to click it here and not here. So that's a bit too dark. Let's try something else. Okay, that looks a bit weird. What about sunny afternoon? Well, I guess none of these are perfect right now. So let's just go ahead and start with something else. Now the lights themselves are usually in a prefab called lights. So if we find one of these, we can see that inside them we might have a bunch of lights and also a post-processing profile, which we might want to turn off because we're already using our own. And sometimes they're just called the name of the lighting setup. Anyway, over here let's start with the sunny day setting. Just turn off this profile. We see that we have some main lights over here. Well, I guess I can copy and paste them. Let's turn off our original directional light, and this is going to be the lighting setup that we start with. Now it's using a skybox that looks a bit wonky, so I'm just gonna double click on that and then go to my inspector, just change it to something a little bit more believable. So as I mentioned in the earlier part of this video, we want the sky generally to be brighter than the faraway things, but as you will see with our volumetric setup, this will happen automatically. So let's try to set up some volumetrics. We can go to our camera, and then the same way we added the post-processing profile, we can add aura camera. Or we could just click this button over here, and it should do the same thing. Now as you can see, it's already added some fog in the background, so we can go ahead and turn off this fog in our lighting settings. If you don't know where that is, it's in general rendering lighting settings. And then if we go to the settings, we can adjust what the default fog amount and fog settings will be for the scene. So for example, if I want a very foggy scene, I can go with a higher value. If I don't want a very foggy scene, I can have something a bit lower. Now we can start with a preset for one of these. So here we have a few which can be good starting points for us. So let's just try the sunny day setting. So you can see that that's working pretty well already. And if we click through some of the other ones, we can see that there's a few moods over here which will do a good job for us. Like this one looks pretty cool. Let's see, it's snowy and desert. Okay. Anyway, let's go with the sunny day, and then we can tweak it from there. Let's find the camera. As I mentioned, this will apply for the whole scene, but we can also do this manually using fog volumes, which if you've used other 3D software, basically works the same way. So we can tell the program where the fog lies, like for example, if you want fog on the ground, or if you want the distance of the fog to fall off in a specific way, we can do that. Another way is if we do want to use the camera, we can set the extinction rate to make it so the things closer to the camera are not as foggy, which can usually do a good job on its own. But let's just go with no density over here, so no fog, and then we can create our fog volume. We can create these with any of these primitive shapes, but let's just go with a global volume to apply to everything. So you just click on that, and then you click somewhere in the scene, and it should create it. As you can see, obviously it's way too foggy, so we can turn it back. So this will be our main fog. We can also change some settings to make it so the ambient lighting is showing through our fog. Let me just turn it up so we can see it better. So right now our ambient light is a bit desaturated, I guess, but if we change this color, we should see it reflected in the fog as well as in the environment. So to test it, let's just go with green. Let's go to the camera, make sure the ambient lighting thing is checked. Like we can color it more or less based on this multiplier, or we can tint it to whatever we want, honestly, but the ambient light should be fine for now. Okay, so what do we do now after we make this not green? Let's choose a blue fog color because our sky is basically going to be blue, and we're going to have a warm light for the sun. So let's find our directional light. Over here we have two. We have one for the sky and then one for the sun. And you can see that they already have light cookies enabled. So the thing that light cookies do is they make the light less uniform. So for example, if I turn it up, I can demonstrate by turning this off. You can see that without the cookie, it just lights everything super equally, which is fine if it's a sunny day, and then we can always add the shadows where we want them. For example, let's see which direction is the light coming from. For example, we can put objects here to obstruct certain areas. For example, if you want some shadow here and then some shadow over here, So there's less contrast. We can just add more shapes. We just tweak this a little bit. So this way we can draw the eye of the viewer a bit better. So this is something that you're probably gonna have to do if you use like super bright or super sunny scenes. Now as far as fog goes, we can make these other volumes which will tweak the existing fog. So for example, this one over here adds 5 density to the existing like 0.01 or whatever we put in. So we could have it also take away fog if we want to have certain areas sharper than others. But let's go with adding fog, and then we can place it closer to the ground and have some kind of fog on the ground. Now you can change how this fades using these sliders, like for example the height. Let me zoom in so we can see that clearly. This light is very bright. So you can see the box over here. And bring it up. You can see the boundaries. So this is the inner boundary. It's at 100% opacity basically here, and then it fades out towards the edges. So let's just change the height fade. So it fades out a bit more as it goes up, and then leave this kind of close to the ground. This is gonna pick up the ambient light that we set up for our camera, but as with everything else, we can tweak it so it gives off a different color. Like let's say we want it to be pink. There's some pink fog on the ground or whatever, and we just want it everywhere, and that's fairly easy to do. And we can also make it emit more light by adding it with this. So here, if we tweak the strength, for example, we can have it be some very bright kind of illuminating light. So depending on what we're going for, we can use these settings. Usually I use the temperature sliders on the light sources because I find it easier than trying to pick an exact shade of yellow or red or whatever. So it's super simple because you can just change how warm or cool something is, which is what matters most anyway. So let's say we want a reasonably warm light, and then our shadows are already pretty cool. We could cool them down even more, but it's probably fine. Let's see this skylight as well. The skylight here doesn't have a cookie. We could add one by just typing cookie, and then the second one I believe is the one for the shadows. And then if we move around the light source, I mean the directional light, we can choose where this goes. Same thing goes for the sun, if we have a cookie for that. I think it's this one. Then we can just move it around so the light focuses on the area that we want to focus, which makes it much easier for us because we don't have to put in fake shadows and like blend everything together and try to figure out how to focus the light on this bit. Now, one thing that I used to do that is maybe not as relevant now is I would make planes. So go to 3D object, plane, then maybe put it over here behind him, and then I would add a light shaft material to him. So it doesn't really matter which one. You can always like copy paste it and tweak it however you like. So let's turn off cast shadows, and if we edit this, we can see that this is basically like adding some fake fog. And right now this one is a even gradient, but obviously you can choose a different texture for it. So sphere, not sure what would be a gradient. Like this one is the one I'm used to. So you can put this behind key objects that you want to have more fog behind them, make it a bit more desaturated, and then it just helps things pop. Obviously you can do this with the aura thing. You can just create a different fog volume, either a cube or the layer. So let's just try the layer for now. The layer is basically a gradient. So at the start it does nothing, and then as it goes from one end to the other, it blends it together. So I'm not sure which end is which. I'll just try it. Okay. So right now you have your regular global fog over here, and then as the geometry goes in this direction, it blends from that to +5. So let's say we can make it 1, and we can have the fog in very specific locations. Like if we want there to be a huge plane over here, like a wall of fog, then this is what we'll do. We can also crank the density, and this works in basically the same way as the light shaft that I've been using. We can also have it do the same thing as the cube. So for example, if you want to have the fog close to the ground in the whole scene, then we can do this, and it'll be easier than tweaking the other stuff. Okay, now let's see how we can make the lights volumetric. Over here, it's already added aura light components to our lights, but that's because we clicked on a preset earlier, which probably did that. If we didn't have these, then we can, let me just remove it. So if we didn't have these, we could click the plus button, or we could go here and just add aura light to this. Now you don't really see any light rays or anything because there's just not a lot of fog in our scene. But if we crank this, it'll basically fake that / override it and make it so our light source is just creating fog where it hits, basically. So if you move it to the side, for example, obviously it's a lot more visible. You have the smooth gradient over here, and we have some scattering controls to control how this scatters into the camera, basically. So you don't really have to know how this works because I have no idea how it works, but you can tweak it if you want some different results and see if you like it or not. So as far as I can tell, the higher this value is, the more even it is towards everywhere, and the lower this value is, the less it goes directly into the camera. So let's try it with some other lights. Point light works in exactly the same way as the other stuff. And we just go, add an aura light to it, and it's instantly volumetric. The brighter your light, obviously, the more it's going to bloom like this for the fog. But as with everything else, we can control it and have it artificially higher or lower. So let's say you want a lens flare, like really warm sunlight coming from here. You could use a directional light, but then sometimes it just goes over the whole image. So we can use the temperature, make a really warm light, click use color temperature tint, and then put it in the place that we want it. Let's see over here, and boost it. So instantly, it's kind of like a sun. And if we put back our actual sun, then maybe make it not do all of this volumetric stuff. Okay, maybe a little bit. We have the benefits of both of these things. Keep in mind that while all of this stuff is pretty cool, your scene still doesn't have global illumination in the same way that some other 3D software would have. Right now, I noticed over here that some of the shadows are bugged, so I'm gonna just change the bias. Maybe he's not on the ground? That's weird. Oh, okay, he's floating. It doesn't matter. Even though it's not realistic, we can fake some of this realism by just adding some custom lights ourselves. So for example, the ground over here might be reflecting some light into the Mutog or the guy. We could just globally add some ground color and then make it so it lights them up basically, or we could use our custom lights and just add a point light somewhere around here and make it warm to fake some of this. It's just change the sunlight so it's coming from the side, because be a bit more readable. And let's move this point light. Where is it? So it's not as distracting. Now, okay, so let's think about how we can push this lighting. What I think I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make a very warm version of this scene, and then I'm gonna make a very cold version of this scene, and then we can blend between those in Photoshop. So let's just up this light source, make it really big, big nice sunlight, and then I'm gonna rotate this so it looks a bit more like it's coming from that direction. And then to screenshot this, we're gonna go to Tools, add Kajawa, and Instant High-Res Screenshot. Here we choose our resolution. We choose where we want to save the stuff. And we choose our camera. Boom. Let's try to go in the other direction with the lighting. So let's turn off all of these lights again and have a dark scene. And then go to our camera, just choose another preset. Let's choose the rainy day preset. Not sure I like that, but it's fine. Let's just make the skybox darker. So let's say we're going for a more nighttime scene. And more like this. And then let's check these volumes to make them less bright, basically. So here I have quite a bit of fog. I think that's just because the colors over here are a bit bright. So let's just go with a darker ambient color, and so everything is pretty close to black. Now in darker scenes we rely more on point lights and smaller light sources. So let's just go and create something, and we can decide what exactly this is. Like it could be one of those glowy alien light source things. Let's just put that here, make it a bit stronger, and maybe make the scene a lot less foggy. Alright, cool. As I mentioned earlier, with the artificial light sources, it's a lot easier to create a focal point, because just putting in a color here that isn't in the rest of the image will draw our eye to this area. So let's go with a smaller light source and let's have it cast some shadows. Now this reads decently well, but the sky is a bit too dark for what we're going for, so I'm just gonna turn that down a little bit. We could also do this in post, it doesn't really matter. So I'm gonna just make sure that our light is taking the ambient light. Okay, maybe this will be a problem. So we can probably fake it by just having a directional light coming from the bottom, giving us just a little bit of detail in these areas. so they're not just completely black. Now for let me just change this to none. Now for these artificial light sources, the thing in Unity is that they can oftentimes feel a bit fake because they're very uniform and they just light everything equally, especially the point lights and the spotlights and whatever. So we can use cookies here as well. I don't really have any point light cookies, but I will do soon, and I'll share those with you as soon as we buy them. But we can try with a spotlight, for example. Just Control Shift F. Just focus it somewhere on these guys. And make it less saturated. And now here in cookies, just type in cookie. And we can have it like some kind of street light or whatever. And if we want to, we can have it casting some more light rays over here. And with all of these lights, we can enable or disable the shadows based on what we're going for. We can enable or disable the cookies and change all of this other stuff. Let's go with a warmer kind of spotlight because the rest of our image is pretty cold anyway. I'm gonna go to the camera and then just change the color of the fog in general to be very slightly cool. This is gonna affect the lights as well. So if we add more density to the scene as a whole, it is going to make the volumetric effects on all of the lights a lot more visible. So let's just go back to this. It's pretty bright. Make it even warmer, or neutral, I guess. And then we have another image. Now if we want, we can add some other lights to the image and add some detail, some of the background elements. So let's say we have a light over, we have a light over here, maybe highlighting some stuff. We can think about what this is. So it makes sense to have the lights feel like they're part of the world. So for example, if this is a street light, we can have other street lights over here to first of all give context to this one and also make the image a bit more uniform. But we could basically do whatever we want with the background as long as the light isn't as bright as in the focal point and it's not like super saturated, so it doesn't draw the eye too much to those areas. So let's say we have something over here, just make it a little bit bigger and brighter. So this way we can have some silhouettes, a little bit of information in the background. Let's have something over here, behind the buildings maybe a bit more volumetric to show this silhouette over here, and a little bit of these trees. We still have it pretty simple behind both of these characters, so they would read super easily. And let's maybe have something else over here to kind of make him not as lost in the background, to kind of silhouette him a little bit. So now let's talk a bit about render passes. If we go to our camera settings over here, in the quality settings, we have a bunch of options, and one of them is display volumetric lighting only. So for example, if you want to do a render pass and then composite this over another image, so maybe you have one with the volumetrics and one without, and then you just choose where you want all of this fog to go, but then you can do that. I'll just go back to this, take screenshot, and now we have that. And then we can turn it off by turning off the volumes, I guess, and I guess turning off everything else. So now in Photoshop we can just choose this as screen blend mode, and then we can control this how we like let's say we want a little bit more here, a little bit less here, and then we have full control over this. And this is why it can sometimes be useful to do different versions of an image and then blend them together. Like for example, if I like how the shadows of this look, even though like right now they're a bit too dark, but I like the lighting of this one, we can always combine those two and then have a different result. So this is probably a better example of this, where I've rendered out the volumetrics separately and then I've just overlaid them over here, and maybe I think that there's too much fog over here, so I just add a mask and now it's more focused towards this bit. And likewise over here I can basically draw in my God rays if I can't set it up exactly the way I want it inside the software, and this gives me more control in the final image. And this is another example with the sliding pass where I have something that looks like this, and then I can overlay it over my other image which already has volumetrics, just a different image, and I can choose to add some of these back in to highlight the areas that I want to highlight. So without the mask it would be something like this, but by blending these we can get like a middle result which can be better. Obviously sometimes you're gonna want to export the separate elements with an alpha or some kind of selection or cutout, so you can paint within these objects without having to, you know, manually select them. Or for example, if you want to see something that's behind the Mutag, then you're gonna want a render with just the background, and I'm gonna talk about how you can do some of those. So obviously you can just hide some of the characters, oof, and then and then just render a pass like this. Oh, what the fuck? And just render a pass like this, and then you can do the same thing by just hiding all of the background layers. But the thing is, if you want an alpha channel, you're gonna want to press this, and in the camera you're gonna want to turn off all of these things and change the clear flags over here to depth only, because otherwise the camera kind of thinks that there's a solid color behind here or a skybox color, and it's not going to render the alpha. So here, because I have another camera, it's doing this weird stuff. Let me just turn that off. And now if we render this, we should have the background separated, and obviously we can just hide all of the background elements, and then we'll have these guys as a selection. So let me just do that real quick. Bloop, 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 bloop. Big screenshot. Now we have a selection of these. Another thing you can do now, because Chris made a nice shader thing, is you can actually render Z-Def pretty easily by just adding this component to the camera. So I'll share that with you guys as well. So you just select the minimum distance and a maximum distance. Like let's say I want to separate the background, so I'm gonna go here and find kind of where the cutoff point is, and then I can use this as a selection if I, for example, want to add more fog or any other kind of depth effects, or if I want to have something that's behind him but it's like also behind these grass things, then this is a good option. The thing is that this doesn't work with depth of field, because even if I put this on, So as you can see, it's still sharp in the background. There are some workarounds to this. If it's really important that you have a lot of depth of field and you want a selection without just like blurring the selection in Photoshop, you could, for example, do something like a green screen. Like, let's get the camera. This is the camera, and then set it to solid color. Maybe have a green or some kind of color that isn't in the rest of the scene. And make sure to turn off the bloom and stuff so there's no like a weird spillover. And we can also use this as a selection and make sure to uncheck transparent background. I'm also gonna talk briefly about depth of field. Like, depth of field is great, but sometimes you can make things that look a bit unnatural. Because with cameras, the more wide angle your lens, the bigger this number is, the less depth of field you usually have. For example, if you look at fisheye photos, you usually have almost no depth of field in any of those pictures, even if you use an aperture that's quite low. Over here, we have a focal length slider, which kind of represents that. So for example, if you have a long lens, so short FOV or large focal length, then at the same aperture, we're gonna have more of a depth of field effect. And if you overdo the depth of field, it can kind of look like miniature photography, where you have a long lens and thus a very shallow depth of field, so not a lot of things are in focus. Despite this, you have quite a bit of freedom here to do stuff that doesn't look wonky. So even though this is a pretty wide angle lens, I could have a little bit of depth of field in the background just to blur things out a little bit so they're less in focus. Now, I could take multiple pictures if I'm having trouble keeping both of these things in focus, or I can try to move the focal distance somewhere in between them and just kind of do this. And then now they should both be in focus while the background is a bit blurred. And it's not super blurred, so it looks fine. Okay, so let's talk about setting up your scene, masks, and selections. You can see that I've dragged all of my renders into this Photoshop file, but we're gonna need to organize some of this so we can actually use it. So this is gonna be our main render, and let's start working off this. So I'm gonna just make it red. We can see over here that we have a cutout of both our subjects. So we can use this as a mask, and for example, just copy the main render and then clip it on this, and then now we have these guys with processing on their own thing, and we can always just clip another layer and just paint over them and do whatever we want. In a similar way, we can do something with this layer, but this time I'm gonna select the contents by control clicking this, and then I'm gonna just use this as a mask. So if you click this mask button, it'll convert your selection to a mask. You can invert it if you want, or you can alt click it to mask the inverse of the selection. So let's say I'm gonna use this render, I think, because this is our background thing, and I'm just gonna alt click and drag this to copy the mask from this layer to this layer. So now we have, let me just invert this. So now we have the background on its own layer, and obviously we can clip stuff onto this, and yeah, and then on the background it's exactly the same thing. I mean, we could do it the other way around. So let's say I have this layer and it has the inverse of this. I can just put that on top anywhere, really, and then I can just paint into this. But what about Z-depth? So I have a Z-depth pass over here, and there's a few ways to do this. Let's say we can adjust this selection. Like, maybe I want this guy and the Mootog a bit more dark, so we lose a bit of information and the rest of it. So for example, if I want to paint behind him, maybe some extra fog, let me just edit this. And then I can Control A to select all, Control C to copy this, and then create a mask. It doesn't matter where I create this mask. And then if you out-click the mask, you get to preview it. So I can Control A again, select all, and then just paste my black and white image into this. So for example, this mask that we have on this layer, I can also out-click that and I can check it out. And obviously I can just paint some stuff into it. If I don't like the selection, like over here, I guess I might not want this. I might want part of the selection. I might want to group these for whatever reason. It doesn't really matter. Or I can, you know, edit the mask using curves or levels or whatever, and then out-click it again to get out of that. So right now, if I want, I can either merge some things down by just Control E, like if there's not a bunch of stuff clipped onto them, and I can have this as its own layer. Then I can lock the transparency, you know, paint again, or just clip some more layers on top of it. It doesn't matter, like I can organize this any way I want, depending on what I want to do. But for now I have this as my foreground. I have this over here as my depth mask. Like let's say I want to paint some extra fog behind the Mutag. Let's say it's blue. I can just out-click this, or I can just drag the mask, and then I can use the ZDepth pass for, I mean, for what it's made for, basically. Cool. Now I can also blend my other render passes with this. Like for example, if I really like the sunlight, I could just create a mask and, you know, do whatever. Even though this wouldn't really make sense, but in some other cases, like for example here, I might have like a render of how I want the things in shadow to look, and then a render of how I want the things in light to look, and then I can blend between them freely. So for example, I might like this pass, but maybe there's a bit too much fog in here for me, or maybe I have a different render pass that has very sharp sunlight. So for example, if I turn this off, you can see that one of my render passes has kind of sharp lights, and I might want to fade those out a bit, which is why I just make one with the light off, and then I manually kind of mask it out. Same thing here. You know how we rendered out this pass earlier? This, we can use the same volumetrics in this other scene, maybe just tweak it a bit so it's different colors, and we can achieve lots of different effects this way. I can even just duplicate it to enhance this, or maybe I want a little bit of this. Oh. If you shift click on masks, then it turns them off, so you can preview what your mask is doing. Also, if you out click on this eye icon on any of the layers, you can solo it. So if I'm like, okay, I forgot what this layer was, I can just out click and then boom, I'm there. Let's say that I like this render, but for some reason it's just too bright for me. I'm gonna do the same thing that we did for the lights, and then I can mask out some of these areas. Like let's say I want this to be like super dark, I want the sky to be dark. I can select the sky from our earlier mask, just Control H to hide it, and then for example I can paint in where I want this, and then maybe a 50% opacity for this. One really cool thing in Photoshop you can do, if you're aiming for a specific kind of colors and you just can't really get them in the engine, and you have a reference that's kind of close to what you want, is you can just copy paste the image into your Photoshop file, and then go to Image, Adjustments, and Match Color. Select the layer. So in this case, it's called Layer 6. And then you can adjust these sliders to kind of take some of the colors from that image and put it into your own. So before and after, it's a pretty decent change. And for example, if you want it to be just the colors that you take, you can change this to color. Like there's still a difference, or you can change it to luminosity if you just want to take the contrast. And yeah, here's a few that I did like super quickly with some other images. So it's a really easy way to iterate on some of these, and obviously you can blend between them or edit them. Like for example, say that I really like this blue one, but I think it's just kind of low contrast. Just bring up my curves or levels or whatever I'm gonna use, and just put that back in. Or for example, I might not like this bit because this is a bit weird, but I might like the really warm part of this, so I'll just mask this in, and then we can experiment with a lot of things very fast. So one thing that I do in Photoshop with the overpaints is I sometimes like to over exaggerate some of these blooms or flares or whatever. It just kind of makes the lights feel a bit more bright. So obviously you can do this in Unity, but I generally prefer to keep the bloom setting in Unity a bit lower, so I have a bit more control for how I want to add these. So for example, I can go to overlay or linear dodge. Like linear dodge is pretty fine, and then I can find this area and just like exaggerate this. Now obviously this is a bit too much, right? So I can turn down the fill or turn down the opacity, but like my goal could be to just add a little bit more color in this. So maybe just make this even brighter. If I want this orange, or maybe I want this part to be orange as well, let me just select this color and paint it over here. And obviously we can use our masks and selections and whatever to help us do this. So let's say we want to add a bloom over here where the light is hitting him. We can just create a new layer and do the same thing. Either linear dodge or screen or overlay. Like it doesn't really matter. They look different, so figure out what you want to do. And let's just bring this back to all layers. Maybe I want this blue, and then I'm just gonna paint in some specks. Like obviously you can do this with color dodge or with any of the other stuff. If you are doing it with color dodge, color dodge is a bit more it blends differently based on the alpha and the brightness. So you can go here and just turn off transparency shapes layer, and then it should function as it should. Or you can make a black layer on color dodge and then clip all of this stuff onto it. But for now, let's just go with linear dodge. Now obviously this is way too intense, plus I have drawn it with my mouse. So let's just turn it down a bit, and maybe we want this only on the highlights, or mostly on the highlights. So we can double click this and choose how we blend this together. So for example, let's make it so it doesn't affect the lower layer if it's darker, and if we hold out, we can drag this out to blend it in a bit more. So the difference is that over here your darks might get a bit more washed out, and over here they stay the same, but you can still have the gradient of light over here. So this is especially useful if you want to highlight specific lit areas instead of just having the bloom effect. So For example, if I paint it in here, you can see that it lightens things as if more light is hitting it, kind of similar to what overlay does. But if I turn this off, you can see the difference this makes. Like, it looks kind of a bit too uniform if you just have it affecting everything equally. So this can help you. One thing that is pretty common in photography and all of these kinds of illustrations is just having a vignette. So the way I usually do it is not like a super fancy way. Obviously there's like technically better ways, but I find this is the fastest. I just make a dark layer. Like, it can be dark blue, it can be black, it doesn't really matter. And then I just quickly paint with some gradients, more or less how I want the gradient, the vignette to be. For example, this might be fine. I might want to make it multiply, and I can also color it in. Let's say I pick this blue, boom, and now the vignette is blue. It looks a bit weird over here, but it doesn't really matter. Another thing, as I mentioned, is the overlay thing to exaggerate some lights and darks. Over here, our image is already like super high contrast, but I'll demonstrate anyway. I like using overlay because it's super simple, and if I want to lighten something, I just paint with white. If I want to darken something, I paint with black, and then let's say we can turn on the opacity, and then we have a bit of a difference, but we can lead people's eyes very easily using this, because it's not super noticeable to look janky. But for example, if I paint in black over here and then I paint in white over here, it will have a subtle gradient that just leads our eyes towards this a bit more naturally. Another thing that can be useful is if you want to group our shadows together, we can kind of do that using the value selecting thing that we did earlier. So let's say I want these shadows to be a bit bluish. I'm gonna set this to multiply. You can also do normal if it's a dark color, it doesn't really matter. Let's go even darker and less saturated. And over here, you can choose exactly at what point we want this to blend. So let's say that's all of our lights more or less, and then everything else is in shadow. We just out-click this to fade it in, and then we have basically exaggerated the contrast between the lights and the darks. And obviously it looks like garbage right now, but we can just turn down the opacity, and then it'll be less noticeable, but it can in some cases give us a better graphic read. Or if, for example, we just want more contrast out of the image, it's a pretty decent way to do this. And speaking of selections, I'm gonna quickly go over quick select, because a lot of people don't use it, and it makes managing your layers a lot easier. So you don't have to name everything, and you can just click on the things that you want and select them. So if you hold Control while using the Move tool, or if you just click this, you can select a layer by clicking on it, or you can right click and then choose one of the layers that is over your cursor. So the way that this makes it really easy to manage layers is, for example, if I want to select this dude, I don't have to name him anything special or like look through my 1 million layers over here to find him. I can just click on him and just move him around. So you can also hold Shift, select multiple things. So for example, this text and the background, I can select both at the same time, or I can select some of these things, and it's pretty easy. You can also group things together. For example, I have some of the website parts as groups. So for example, this thing is a whole group. And over here in the quick select thing, you can click on group, and then when you select things, instead of selecting the single layer, it selects the overall group. Like for example, I have all of these in one group, and then this guy in one group with all of this stuff. And yeah, just makes your life a lot easier. One other thing I forgot to mention is that for grayscale things, or I mean big blocks of color, it's also easy to select them automatically using select and color area. So for example, now if I click the white, it gives me a fuzziness control, and I can select the things that are close to white. So let's see how good this selection is. I'm gonna pick an orange, and it's fine. Now, one last thing I want to mention is that it's good to plan out what you want to do in the overpaint before you actually start overpainting, because sometimes we can look at the image and then we're not too sure what we want to do, but we start like experimenting with things, and then we end up losing a lot of time just trying different things out instead of just thinking for a minute or two about what we want to show, what we want to emphasize. So this is something that Jama talks about a lot. You don't have to do a quick sketch or like plan it out in a super detailed way, but it helps if you know what you want to achieve and what you're gonna do to achieve it. So for example, in this image, these guys are gonna get a bit of fog, so they're less contrasty and they don't attract your information as much. And then these guys are gonna get a little bit of a boosted contrast. And this is also good to think about during the lighting in the Unity stage, because the closer you get to your goal in Unity, the easier the overpaint will be. So you won't have to tweak as many things. Like for example, in this image, if I want everything to be darker, like have the image focus on these lights. So this is basically the brightest part, and then I have these guys maybe get a rim light. Let me just get out my pen. Maybe I'm gonna want these guys to get lit a bit from that, and then I might want them to be a bit more silhouetted, and then I have the blue light hitting them from the back so they don't lose all of their form. And then I can see that this is the only blue thing in the image, but I might not want it to attract as much attention, so I might look for ways to desaturate it or make it less prominent and focus on all of the warm stuff in here, like super saturated Phoenix armor, and this guy's orange armor and stuff. And then I might want to clean up this reed so it's not as contrasty, and maybe clean up some of these shapes. And you can see that in about 2 minutes we've more or less planned out what we're gonna be doing later on in the overpainting process, and then we can work much more efficiently.